So our second snippet for this week looks at constitutional controversies during the Bush administration and the run-up to the Bush administration. So basically election issues and the war on terror. So the 2000 election ends with this very close contest between Al Gore, the vice president, and George W. Bush, the governor of Texas, where the key is Florida. Whichever party wins Florida is going to win the election. And after all of the votes are counted in Florida, Bush is ahead by a few hundred votes. And there seem to be some real problems. There is a sense, and I think this is almost certainly true, that a majority of people who went to the polling booth on election day 2000 were intending to vote for Gore. But they were frustrated from doing so for a couple of things. The first was this so-called butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County, which is a very kind of confusing ballot where you had to just punch into one of these holes here in the middle. And Gore had the misfortune of being second under Bush. But he was the third punch hole because what they did was to punch, you could punch the Buchanan ticket. Buchanan was this far right independent candidate running. And around 8,000 voters in Palm Beach County voted for Pat Buchanan. Palm Beach County is a county with fairly heavy Jewish population. Pat Buchanan is someone where there were very credible allegations of anti-Semitism. It seems extremely unlikely that 8,000 residents of Palm Beach County wanted to vote for Buchanan, but nonetheless, these Gore people made a mistake, and there was nothing that could be done. Similarly, the Secretary of State of Florida, this woman, Katherine Harris, who was the chief election officer of the state, a few weeks before election, removed a significant number of people from the voting rolls, arguing that they were improperly registered. And this purge disproportionately affected Haitian Americans, of a strong Democratic voting bloc in Miami. So you had these people who got to polls on election day, thought they were registered, and it turns out they were not, and they were stuck. Harris was both the chief election officer of the state and the co-chair of the Bush campaign in the state. She was in charge of the initial count. She very quickly certified the election in favor of Bush, and that gave Bush an advantage throughout. Harris was played by Laura Dern in it's an HBO film called Recount, and this is an excerpt from the film. Harris was widely mocked by late-night talk show hosts. She was also someone she's very, very conservative Christian, and she sort of saw herself as reliving, sort of the heroes of the Bible were manifesting themselves in her. And this clip, if anything, Dern underplays her. It gives a sense of who was running things in terms of Florida elections in 2000.
Don't you worry, Mac. It's going to take a lot more than David Letterman making fun of my hair and makeup to knock me down.
That is exactly why I backed your campaign when everyone else ran over to Mortham, because you are a woman of action.
A woman of action, like Queen Esther.
Queen Esther?
I have been reading my Bible quite a bit here lately, and I have been feeling this unusually strong kinship with Queen Esther. You recall Queen Esther? She was willing to sacrifice herself to save the lovely Jewish people. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. And if I perish, I perish.
I mean, this is, it's an intriguing approach to politics. But the issue, the election is certified. Bush is certified the winner, and under Florida law, Gore, because the race was so close, had the legal right to request a recount. He could have requested a statewide recount, comprehensive recount, all ballots, he did not do that. This was a fatal mistake, both in terms of public relations and actually in terms of the outcome. Instead, he only requested a recount in these 4 dark blue counties here that I have on the map: Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, Broward, and Volusia County, which is Orlando. All of these counties were heavily Democratic counties, so it seemed like Gore was really kind of gaming the system. The 4 counties undertook a painstaking recount. Each of the 4 used slightly different procedures. This is from Palm Beach County, where the inspectors would try to determine whether you had to punch through a paper card here to determine how you voted. Sometimes there would be a punch that would just be like an indentation. Sometimes there'd be a punch that would be a partial punch. These things we all learned are called chads, and the issue was, how do you deal with a hanging chad where it looks like the voter intended to punch through the paper but never quite did so. It's not a perfect process. The Bush campaign goes to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision with the 5 most conservative justices signing on, in Bush versus Gore, the court shuts down the recount. They say that it's a violation of the 14th Amendment. It's treating different votes differently, which is unfair. But in an extraordinary line, the court says our consideration is limited to the present circumstances, for the problem of equal protection in the election processes generally presents many complexities. The Supreme Court is the high court because, in part, it creates precedent, which then can be used by lower courts to judge the cases that come before them. The Supreme Court, this is extremely rare what they did in this case. The Supreme Court doesn't do these one-off things where they say, all right, we're issuing a ruling here, but you can't apply it to any other cases. One of the great ironies of this is that if the Supreme Court had allowed the vote to go through, under Florida has this very aggressive, it's called the Sunshine Law. So government documents can be requested by the public, and a media consortium in 2001 does this request. If the Supreme Court had allowed the recount to go through, and the Gore request had been what was requested, the final winner would have been Bush by 225 votes. So the irony here is that we hear a lot this idea, well, Bush versus Gore won the election for Bush. That's not the case. If the recount had gone forward, Bush still would have won. But the irony here is that if Gore had requested that every ballot in every county be recounted, something he never requested, Gore actually would have been elected by 171 votes. So imagine if you're Al Gore. I mean, you have to live the rest of your life knowing that basically you screwed up tactically here. You should have done a statewide recount, and you might very well have won. But the perception from Bush versus Gore is that it's a partisan decision. The conservatives vote for Bush, the liberals vote for Gore. The reasoning of the decision is a little bit shaky, but there is finality. Once the court makes its decision, Bush has won the election. The other big constitutional issue in terms of policy from the Bush years is the relationship between the Constitution and the war on terror, where Bush is nominally in charge, but especially in the first term, the Vice President, Dick Cheney, is really running things. Cheney is very aggressive, arguing for robust executive authority. The White House Legal Counsel's Office, called the Office for Legal Counsel, OLC, which is run by these guys, Jay Bybee and John Yoo, during the Bush years, articulates this very aggressive conception of presidential power. This is from a memorandum of the OLC. The OLC's job is to give the president legal advice on what he, or eventually she, can or cannot do. And basically what the OLC says is, look, it's the president's job to interpret statutes. If he wants to engage in behavior that would seem to be torture under either American law or international law, perfectly fine for him to do that, as long as he, does some certification through this memo saying, it's not torture, or we have to do it for the broader good of the country. This memo was eventually withdrawn. It's a it's a really problematic memo, but the handling of torture, civil liberties, and terrorism suspects twice makes it to the Supreme Court during the Bush years. And on both occasions, the Supreme Court says that detained suspects, and we're talking about here mostly people who were detained in the Guantanamo Bay naval base, have some constitutional rights, even though the court doesn't really want to push too far here. The first is this case called Hamdi versus Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld is the Secretary of Defense under Bush, where the court in a 5-3 decision says, we have long since made clear that a state of war is not a blank check for the president when it comes to the rights of the nation's citizens. The court doesn't say that a terrorism suspect has to get a full civil trial in public court, but they say they have to give some due process rights to these terrorism suspects. And then in Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, which is from 2006, which again deals with this question of what rights do terrorist suspects have. A 5-4 vote with Justice Kennedy, the swing voter, voting with the 4 liberals, saying that the executive is bound to comply with the rule of law. Basically, the issue in both Hamdi and Hamdan was, can the courts exercise some degree of judicial review if the president says he's doing something to protect the country from an imminent terrorist attack? And on both cases, the court says yes. They don't really push the issue. Obviously, people who are in Guantanamo, are not receiving the full protections of the Constitution, and no one is really ever held responsible for engaging in torture of at least a handful of the Guantanamo Bay suspects. So the two of the key constitutional issues during the Bush years are, one is the issue of the election law, in the sense that the courts seem to be partisan in their handling of it, and second, this issue of terrorism and civil liberties, where the courts say in these two very important decisions that even suspects accused of the most venal behavior in a national security context do have some rights to a fair proceeding before the government finds them guilty. So that's it for our second snippet for the